Hi, this is Nick Dawson, the editor-in-chief of Talkhouse Film, and you're listening to the Talkhouse Film podcast. I had already assigned a piece on Laura Poitras' gripping and revelatory Edward Snowden doc Citizen 4 when James Marsh, the Oscar-winning director of Man on Wire and a regular Talkhouse Film contributor, emailed me about the movie. So, instead of having him write about the film, I suggested a podcast conversation between him and Poitras. This ended up being one of the rare Talkhouse Film podcasts that was recorded in person, with it taking place in the offices of Radius, Citizen 4's US distributor, the day after the film opened. And it seems fitting that a conversation about a film which tackles the subject of our total lack of privacy in the modern world would be punctuated by the sounds of sirens and mysterious banging noises coming from an adjoining office. Whether or not anyone was actually listening in to what Marsh and Poitras were saying remains unknown. However, here are some of the highlights of what they might have heard.
Well, I've just seen Citizen 4, and if I can play you the compliment saying I think it's the most important film I've seen in many years. I mean, not just because of its obvious historical value, or what will become its historical value, because it's a film that just shows you the modern world in such a fascinating way as a film. And it struck me when I was watching it, I was watching, firstly, a great film, a great piece of filmmaking, a great construction of a film, and also something altogether unique, which was the kind of pivot of history, if you like, turning, which is kind of maybe not to overstate the film's importance, but I think you can. So maybe as a filmmaker, I'm curious about how you approached it on that sort of level of making it so watchable and so gripping. Given the raw materials were very minimalist in a way, in a sense you're in a very undramatic situation. You end up in a hotel room. It's a very sterile, kind of boring hotel room, and yet so much sort of tension and drama is playing out in this sort of banal setting. So as a filmmaker, I was curious how you approached it. Do you see it as a thriller, essentially?
I mean, that's an interesting question, because there are two experiences or two relationships that I had to material. One was kind of more how I approached it as a filmmaker, which was maybe a bit more outside, and how I sort of evaluated what the elements were, but then also how I experienced it as a participant in the events that were unfolding. And the events that were unfolding from the very first email was like being grabbed by the neck and pulled, It was super intense, super emotional, really dangerous, really frightening, really mysterious. So all those kinds of, people talk about it as being as a thriller and sort of think of it as a genre, but actually going through the experience was actually like that. I mean, I didn't know what was going to happen one day to the next, but I knew when I arrived in Hong Kong in this hotel room that I had sort of something extraordinary to be able to work with, which was to document something that you almost never see. I mean, and to have a record of it is happening in real time.
I can't think of any other film. I was thinking one film that came to mind was The Battle of Chile, which is an account of a revolution in Chile, an unsuccessful revolution, or what becomes something very different. But that's sort of documenting history, but it's not enabling history. And in some respects, you're enabling the story to happen by your very presence. And I guess, Edward Snowden chose a filmmaker. He didn't choose a journalist. A filmmaker was part of his idea. He approached you as a filmmaker. So clearly he was aware when he approached you that you were going to make a film.
I don't think so. I don't think so. He actually approached me. He tried to approach Glenn before, but they didn't set up encryption. And he approached me because he knew I was working on the topic, and because because I'd been put on this watch list, so that I was aware of the issue.
And that would give you some cachet, perhaps, in his eyes.
Yeah, I mean, it gave me that, but is actually, I kind of had to push for the filmmaking part of it. I think that he approached me as a journalist saying, I'll give you documents, and the documents are, they're not a bunch of videos and pictures, they're a bunch of print.
Text,
so it's kind of like, well, I'll have to partner up with some people who work
this is what
with
they do.
News organization, because I'm actually a visual journalist and filmmaker, and then in the course of our correspondence, he basically said that he wouldn't remain anonymous. And when he said he wouldn't remain anonymous, that's when I said, well, then we need to meet, and I want to film. And his response was no. He actually said, I don't want you to film, for two reasons. One was he didn't want to be the story, which is sort of a consistent theme,
which is in the film, of course.
He didn't want to be the story, and then also he was worried about the danger of us being at the same place at the same time. So you have to realize this is someone who works in the intelligence community and who knows how it works. And so I think he was worried that, so for instance, if we were meeting and we were raided, could the reporting be stopped? In other words, he would have taken all this risk to bring all this information forward. And if we were at the same place at the same time and someone had heard about it, they could raid us and
so
stop the reporting.
His focus is really
it's
entirely on
completely
the objective.
The objective.
Which is to get these documents and the implications of these documents out into the world.
Yeah. That's absolutely, and that's the risk. It's all about this information. He had evidence, and to get the evidence out, and he reached out to me. So it was actually, I pushed for, once I knew he wasn't going to remain anonymous, then I said, we have to have a meeting. And then that led to a series of conversations about how to do that, how to do it in such a way that if something had happened while we were in the hotel room, that the reporting could continue. So I had to make some plans that allowed for that. But back to your filmmaker question and being, confronted with a hotel room, I was actually I walked into the room, I said, wow, there's not a lot to work with here. All my sort of filmmaker instincts was saying, like, there's a lot of white here. Like, white is not really, the best thing to have to work with in video, and it's a contained space and it's a generic space. I think, though, I didn't appreciate the good things that came of that.
Well, the claustrophobia. I mean, it's like you're all trapped in there, and that's a very strong theme of the film. And what also, I've got so many other questions I want to ask you about when we started out there, to follow on from what you just said, but it strikes you that the enemy, if you like, the antagonist, is invisible. And yet that hotel room, you're very aware of these unknown, unseeable, you can't see the forces that you know are going to descend upon you at a certain point, which makes it, as a film, very gripping, that you are trapped, and there are these very powerful forces that are lurking all around you, unseen, invisible. Let me ask you a question that I think certainly crossed my mind as a filmmaker when you were first approached by Snowden, and I asked myself the question, what would I do? And I think most of us may not have made the choice that you made when you think about what you stand to lose. And I definitely would have made that calculation. And also, I guess, from your point of view, what you stand to gain, or what the world stands to gain by you making that choice. Did you agonize that choice at all? Did you second guess it and begin to see a different future for yourself if you made this choice?
I think by the time he'd contacted me, and so this was, I'd been working on documenting America post 9/11, and so I had seen a lot and been through a lot, and in a way, by the time he had contacted me, I was at a point where I could make that decision. It wasn't a tough one.
Uniquely as a filmmaker in our sort of filmmaking circle, in America, that would be true. So, did you foresee or begin to kind of project into the future what this might mean for your life?
I mean, I knew it was dangerous. I mean, there was no doubt. I knew it was dangerous that the person who was communicating with me had their life on the line, and therefore I had their life in my hands, and that I knew that it was dangerous for the reporting. I mean, that's clear. But I guess I'd been a bit toughened up. Like, there's a way that I'd for so many years being sort of harassed, at the border, and I just think, well, I'm not going to let the fear of the fact that the U.S. government is coming down on journalists and whistleblowers stop me from doing this. Like, it just becomes a calculus of, can you live with the fact that you decided not to? And in my case, I had a certain tolerance for risk at that point. And partly it's because this is my country, I mean, if you think of the risks and the damages that we're causing, globally, I'm in a position of privilege. I can choose where I want to take risks, where I want to go, which is unlike Iraqis or unlike people who are, their drones flying overhead. I mean, I feel like there's a responsibility as a citizen and also as a documentarian. I have some skills that are potentially of use in this, situation. So that's a decision I'd made a while ago, and so, but which isn't to say that it wasn't really frightening. And it was. I mean, what you describe as a sort of unseen, menacing force is something that I've felt from the very early emails that I had, and continue to this very day, where I feel this. You don't quite know where the danger is, but it feels very present.
And one sort of knows, that there's some vindictiveness in how a government will respond to this kind of thing. And when I have learned and read about before you made this film, what was happening to you every time you came to the US, and you could no longer come to the US with any kind of confidence without being humiliated and harassed and just for telling the truth. And that really upset me. I remember reading about this when I was in Copenhagen, and I got really upset thinking that you were paying this price in your life for telling the truth. And that troubles all of us, I think, in the filmmaking community, that someone who's doing our work, I mean, in your case, more bravely than I've ever done, was being subject to this, what seemed like persecution, essentially.
You know, I don't really interpret it that way. Like, I don't think that the U.S. has like some thought police that looks at films.
No, we're giving them too much credit in a way, aren't we?
I think it's a much more inept. I think it's
agree.
Inept, self-perpetuating, secret. You know,
it's kind of bureaucracy
system.
that just trundles towards somebody like you, and it just has to do it.
Right, and then once you kind of get sucked, it's more Kafka-esque. You know, you just can't get out with the maze, and you're sucked in it, and you don't know where the door is, and so I don't feel like that it's my films that are, you know, that
it's just you're just a number and a name that has to be dealt with this way.
But the level of ineptness is kind of profound, because for 6 years they stopped me every time. They asked me the same questions. I stopped answering them. I mean, why? Like, what is the point in continuing to do that? And in the end, it actually, like I say, in a sense, prepared me to make this film, because I had to sort of...
You've been a victim of some of the very same things that Snowden was hoping to expose, I guess.
Yeah, and I had to learn some tools, you know, to just, you know, protect the material that I was working with. Was fine. So in a way, you know, it's a unintended consequences of, you know, of being targeted taught me a little bit about how, you know, to defeat the government at their own game in a certain way. So
kind of like judo, and you're using their strength against them to some extent.
Definitely those days in Hong Kong were the most difficult shooting days I've ever done. I really was aware of the enormity of what was happening, the enormity of the risks he was taking, the enormity of the risks that we were taking as journalists, and just, you know, not knowing if somebody would walk in the door and you know, try to
render him or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually had, you know, usually when I shoot, so I do my own shooting, and I mean, I love shooting. I mean, that's what I love doing more than anything, and I love shooting verite, when things are happening in real time. And usually when I shoot, I know when it's like, oh, that's the moment that's going to be in. Like, I can just filter it, and so it's happened in, you know, conflict zones and every other situation that I've ever filmed, I knew. But this situation, I was in a much more state of shock, and actually there were things that I completely repressed immediately. That I just, like there's a conversation where he and Glenn are talking and the camera's panning back and forth, that I had no memory of ever shooting, that I only saw again once I got to the editing room. And I think that because what they're talking about is how and when to go public, which seemed like a really risky thing to do. And I think that, you know, like sort of my brain just went into like, you know, I need to, you know, in order to keep working, I need to sort of just, you know, repress this for now and then sort of rediscover it later. So I thought that, you know, there was, you know, potential of really negative consequences for everybody, you know, in the room. And
maybe still, you know, let's be clear, I think.
Yeah, I think that, you know, these are really, you know, powerful forces that we've angered. And you know, I know that Glenn has had threats. You know, he's been, I mean, Glenn was immediately attacked after, you know, most forcefully. And of course, you know, Snowden's safety is not assured either.
Were there other films, either documentaries or feature films, that felt like that you were thinking of as you were editing the film, perhaps, or as you were, you know, getting involved? I mean, I'm sure at the moment of when it was all happening, you're just focused, as you say, on what's going on. But were there other documentaries, or because I can't think of anything that is quite like this in terms of being there and documenting something like this as it happens? Maybe you can. I was racking my brain saying, what's this like? It's not like anything else I've ever seen. It's unique.
I mean, I do think, you know, I'm a huge admirer of like the cinema verite tradition of Maisels and Penny Baker and Wiseman, Frederick Wiseman, where, you know, there is an inherent drama to filming things as they happen in real time. And so, but this was an example of, sort of very high stakes.
The stakes could not be higher in a way. Both of the, also it's very much focused on one individual, Snowden.
I have to say, at one point so my editor, I made this film with an extraordinary editor, Mathilde Bonfoy, and who edited Run Lola Run and other fiction films. She also does documentary, and she hadn't seen Man on Wire, so we did a screening of Man on Wire in the middle of editing, and because we were actually interested in this question of courage, and I think that's a portrait of courage that's actually unlike anything I've ever seen, and I think it also hinges on, I think if you didn't have the sort of material, the contemporaneous document of how he prepared for it, that's what sort of gives it its sort of its pulse, and the photographs, that you have these primary documents of.
And also he's able to articulate his motivation.
Yeah.
And very clearly, and that's something again that his character's going to be impugned in every which way.
Right.
But in your film, we're allowed to see a very serious person committing a form of, if you like, social suicide, or he knows his life is going to be utterly different now.
And it is a similar kind of point of no return.
Exactly.
And why does somebody sort of either step
cross
into
that
this wire
threshold,
or get on a plane to Hong Kong? I think on just that's what interests me more than necessarily the issues in the film is how does somebody reach a point in their life where the personal sacrifices become worth it for whatever goal that they're seeking, and so there's something that resonates between these two films. I'm curious, what was your how did you perceive when the stories first started to break, and when we published the interview, what was?
Well, it just struck me that all the things all your worst fears were true in a way, and secondly, I immediately had a kind of response saying I had real admiration for the man who did this. Because you could see what he was, what risks he was taking, how his life was going to change in ways that were going to be probably all bad. And I wish I were more shocked, in a way. It just confirmed all those worst fears you had. And then I gathered, quickly that obviously a film was I was very intrigued by the film. I thought, a film's going to emerge from this. Just putting a sort of professional, personal response saying, well, I can't wait to see it. Because obviously, Laura, I'd known your work, for your two previous films, and felt that you were exactly the right person to be at the heart of this. So part of me was a bit excited about the film that was going to emerge. When you got beyond your indignation and outrage, but just confirming things you wished you didn't think, but here they all are. And then you begin to kind of think about your own life and how. When you see the kind of precautions that are being taken in the film, and that you take, I'm sure, on a daily basis, you can feel, I don't take those precautions. I don't encrypt things.
How old are your kids?
9 and 11.
Do they use the internet, I'm sure?
They're a generation that are going to have a different brain structure, I think, because of the internet and because of iPads and everything else. And their relationship with it is very different from mine. And so what that world will become in 10, 15, I have no idea. And it's not a happy thought, quite honestly. It feels to me that perhaps we've had the golden era of the internet before the golden era of surveillance. That may no longer be true for when they grow up. Who knows? And
are there sort of digital? Are their digital lives online?
Not yet. We're trying to kind of, like all parents, trying to kind of make a boundary about that for all kinds of reasons of people stalking them on all that stuff you worry about as a parent now. And it just seemed to me that going back to you mentioned the Stasi, how it used to be that you'd understand if someone opens a letter or if someone listens in on a phone call, there's something mechanical about that. You can understand that. I just don't understand how they gather all this stuff. And it's that Max Weber's observation about the disenchantment of the world, that we trust things so implicitly that we have no understanding of how they work. And this is a good example of that, and a very sinister example of that. We don't understand any aspects, or I don't, because I'm an ignorant person. I think most of us are like me. We don't understand how these things actually work. Therefore, we don't have the right kind of arguments or the means to stop them happening, because you don't understand the technology. I mean, I think Snowden does, and that's why his background and what he's let us, he's very, very clued up on all this stuff, and you see in the film how what he's doing he's hiding under bedclothes. It's striking, and because he knows the stuff that I don't know.
He's right. I mean, he knows what they're capable of, and he understands the technology well enough to know the dangers. And I think that so he can see ahead, or William Binney can see ahead, and how this all, where it is, and how it can all play out if all you have to do is flip a switch, but the good thing is, and I've spent a lot of time with these communities, is that there are people who are building tools that can resist this, and that's
Indeed.
encryption, and that actually is the powerful thing about this, is that individuals really can actually secure their communication in a way that they don't have to wait for governments to shift.
I'm going to go home and do this.
Yeah.
I was prompted. I thought about it after watching the film, and now I'm going to go on the back of this conversation and look into all this, because I wouldn't want my life to be constructed that way, and for that to be used against me or anyone else that I'm connected to. One thing and feel free not to answer this, is how your life has changed, I guess, from the films that you've made, and how you reconcile yourself to that your work has determined a very different destiny for you than, for example, mine has.
I mean, I definitely feel like that I've been documenting and also sort of caught by historical circumstances and what's happening in the U.S. And so I think I began the work that I'm doing in a much more naive frame of mind, and thinking that what was happening in the U.S. was kind of a moral drift, and that it would come back to something more aligned with basic principles of the country, and now I'm not so certain. It feels that we just keep moving further and further away from, I think, some basic principles, and so I've become more skeptical of the government and what it's. Yeah, actually, having Obama come in and institutionalize or not undo some of the Bush policies and not look into things like torture. I mean, I just think, how is history going to judge this?
Well, very badly.
And
if you think about Watergate and what then happened on the back of Watergate,
it's
which
like
is a
petty
comparable,
crime.
but in fact, in a sense, exactly not a comparable aspect at all. The absence of reckoning with torture, I think, is something that will come back to haunt us.
In a certain way, I feel like this film is really about people like, well, okay, the government, there's no moral leadership in the government right now in the United States. And so now there are people who are saying, well, these are things that the public should know, and that, and so, Snowden or William Binney or journalists who are working, Jeremy Scahill that I work with, people who are just saying these things are wrong. It's not just about politics. It's not about left, right. It's like there's certain things that are just simply wrong. The drone program right now, it's appalling. how are we a country now that flies,
Well, institutionalized murder, essentially.
I don't know, but help me understand why Europe isn't more outraged by this, and just, why is there not more of a European response to what the US is doing?
Well, it's a good question, and I think the government, British government, has been assiduously following, enthusiastically overstepping part. as you say in your film, that they're the worst offenders of all for no reason whatsoever. Right. Quite honestly. And there's a big disconnect between the actual threat and what this is all about. The actual threat is, in a sense, both moral. The whole history of Iraq it's so absurd. What happened? Where we now are in Iraq. It's just, and where's the commentary on that? Yeah. That we have a situation in Iraq now, in Syria, where we have the worst kind of terrorist faction, empowered by American weaponry from an army we spent billions and billions training to. It's just preposterous. That the folly of Iraq, and the folly doesn't really begin to describe it, because hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, innocent people largely, as a result of this. And you combine that with torture and surveillance, you think this is a really fucked up. And how did we get to this point, based on what I saw with my own eyes, 9/11, that happened just down there, and I'm not sure where you were when that happened.
Yeah, I was in New York.
You're in New York, so we saw that. I saw one of the buildings fell down, and you probably had your own, as we all did, all New Yorkers here had their own subjective experience of that. How did they then use our reaction in New York, which was a very, I think, very beautiful reaction after the actual. How did that turn into this?
To get back to your question of how this work has impacted my life personally, I mean, I actually feel I've definitely had to make some sacrifices doing it. I mean, I'm often traveling for a long time, and it's hard to maintain relationships and friendships and stuff. But right now, I feel that I'm actually surrounded, that there is actually a community of people that are willing to come forward or take risks or put themselves on the line in different kinds of ways, not just whistleblowers, but the journalists that I've been working on, or even the people who've supported the film. So it does feel like that it's actually there is something happening. There's something that's happening that's questioning these these policies that the U.S. government, UK government, and others are moving in, and whether or not that will change anything, I don't know. But at least we're trying.
What do you think you might be doing next, if I can ask a leading question?
I'm interested probably more in working different ways than I am in different thematic concerns.
Right.
So I love doing long form, but there is something about the burdens of the narrative that you have to make choices that maybe are not always, that there are other ways to work where other choices can be made. And so I'm going to do something for a museum. I'm going to do something at the Whitney, which will allow me to sort of just be less linear. Like I like the idea of being less linear, more hybrid, not be sort of like, there is something about, story that is so, relentlessly demanding.
Yeah.
You cannot, it knows if you like go astray, you can't say, well, I really love this, but it doesn't fit in the story, but I'm going to keep it in. And so I just want to maybe challenge myself in working in different ways.
Has more free association in it, perhaps.
That's just more that gives more that the audience or viewer can make decisions about how much the linear narrative of how to enter. Did you see? There's a really great the Bowie exhibition that's going around. Did you see it?
No,
at
I haven't seen it yet.
It's
I'm
really
a huge
great.
fan, of course. So
I'm a huge. Yeah. I saw it in Berlin, and it's really fantastic.
A great place to see it, I think.
Of course. Yeah. Berlin. I mean, there's whatever Bowie and the romantic Berlin days.
Those two great. Low. That would have been a great soundtrack for your film.
Yeah. Actually, I thought about contacting him, but
Well, you never know.
Yeah. But it's you enter into a space, and the way it works is that you have these headphones and they're attached to sensors. So if you look at something, you get one audio, and if you're near another audio. So the audience has a way of navigating their own.
So it's more of a subjective
labyrinth.
experience, opposed to the film. You sit there and you watch
exactly,
it.
where we control the cuts.
But I think that sounds like a really fascinating idea to sort of do the work you do, and to have some of the evidence that you have, if you like, and the drama of what you have, and some of the real need for thinking about what this means and what it means for me personally, which is what the film does, again, rather brilliantly, I think, is it puts it down to you again at the end. As a viewer, if you respond to the film, and I think most people will, you're left with a question: what do I do about this?
Yeah, I mean,
how do I change my behavior, or how do I change what I do to somehow push back against this?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely wanted a narrative that pushed outside of the frame.
Yeah, that
didn't offer any, closure, as we say in third act structure, and that I'm really interested in, and just interested in. Yeah, like just pushing myself in different directions. I mean, I don't know how you do. You write the narratives?
Yeah, I do. Certain things I've written.
How do you go about the writing process?
It's kind of a painful one, to be honest. It's 4 hours a day and no more, and essentially writing what you know.
And do you say there's act 1, act 2, act 3, or do you say?
I kind of just blunder into it, and you sort of write your way into something. I'm one for writing lots and then editing, like in a film. Like you shoot a lot and then you cut it down, and what you leave out is really what the story is. What remains is the story. That's how I do, anyways. Is to just keep writing, and most of it's rubbish. But then eventually you begin to find stuff that bears scrutiny after a while.
Yeah.
Is that something you want to do? Dramatic
fiction?
filmmaking?
I mean, I actually I've been asked that. I mean, to me, I feel like maybe one of my best skills or tolerances as a filmmaker is my. I like uncertainty. I like not knowing
So
what's
you
happening.
like the frisson?
I like the
I can't stand it.
Who knows where this is going to
Yeah.
go, and that's exciting attitude towards filming in a verite style. So you're really So I've never really felt of myself a storyteller until I started working in verite documentary, because I don't imagine the whole universe that I'm creating and where it will end. I mean, I'm much more in the present, thinking this is interesting and who knows where it's going to go, and being open to all sort of possible. And there's something about that feels very vital, and that feels like kind of the lifeblood of the work that I do. And I worry that if I was doing fiction, that all that would be sort of stripped away, because you actually know where.
Right, actually. I mean, it's also knowing your strengths as a filmmaker allows you to refine them. And I couldn't do that. I tried to make a verite film, and I found it really, really difficult. My documentaries tend to be reconstructing stories that pre-exist in a way, and finding out the dramatic shape of them as history has left them behind for me to do. I feel like an archaeologist that begins to add things to the building to make it whole again. And what you do, what verite filmmakers do, which I kind of. And my favourite documentaries are all verite documentaries. I'm a huge fan of Frederick Wiseman.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
The sort of poetic sort of verite, if you like. And I found that to be frustrating. I couldn't shape it. I couldn't construct it the way I wanted to. I always missed the best moments. When I was shooting it, I would always miss the thing that was supposed to be, the most exciting thing was going to happen. I missed it. And I'm just not good enough to do that, quite honestly.
I think it's patience. I think it's patience and a certain kind of tolerance.
Exactly. It's a huge amount of patience. It's a much more time-consuming venture. And you've got to know also when you start a film that it may not be a film.
Yeah.
It's
There's
just
all
peter
uncertainty.
out. And life being short, I kind of can't accept those stakes, you know.
Yeah.
I can't recommend the film high enough to people who are listening to this, because it's nothing like I've ever seen before, and it also delivers on a level, as I said at the beginning, as a film. It's not just a documenting of a historical moment. Yeah. It's actually a really, dare I say it, sleek film, and a kind of cool film to watch visually. And it felt like almost a step forward from some of the work you've done before on that level. It did feel really elegant as a thriller, if I can call it that, and that will help people go and see it too, I think, because it's really, really gripping.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things about the response to the film, I mean, I've been doing documentaries for a long time, and I meet people and I tell them what I'm working on, and the response is always, well, you should interview so-and-so. Yeah. And I had to stop them and say, no, this, I go to places and things are happening and I film, and then people keep saying you should interview, and then, so this is an example where I can say, well, yeah, this is what I mean by not interviewing. Yeah. It's, you know what's happening, but it's there's some kind of human drama that's actually palpable in the moment, and it's not about knowing the facts, but it's about seeing choices that people make, and drama is all about action
and choice, as you say, and this film is utterly about choice, and one of the choices is yours, of course, to make it in the first place and to respond to that initial email that you got. When did you show it to Snowden, if you have? I'm sure you have.
Have I? What did I? Yeah.
So have you seen the film?
Yeah. So my editor Matilda and I made a trip to Moscow right before we locked. We wasn't fully locked. It changed, quite a bit. It was probably 3 weeks or a month before we finished. And we screened it. We brought a projector and we screened it for him and Lindsay Mills, his partner, who's now living with him. And so it was intense, particularly because for her, because she experienced this all very differently. She was, she learned what was happening. She was seeing the news, and then to sort of be in the hotel room when it was happening and to see her partner and being
having had no knowledge that this is what he was about to do.
Right. And so I felt there was a sort of palpable, sense of sort of emotional reliving of things, but she's actually an artist, so she was incredibly. I could tell that she needed to process. I mean, take a minute and before she could talk about it, because it was very personal for her. But she approached it really as an artist, and
So she
it
could
was
see
great.
its virtues as a
Yeah,
film,
she was,
I guess.
yeah, she really saw it as
the
a
imagery
film.
being so
Yeah, there was
powerful and
yeah, there's a
close.
couple things that Snowden said. Well, he talked about the hands at the end. He said that's a little bit arty, you know, like removing the pieces of paper at the end. And she was like, but no, it's really. She was like, she was. They had a conversation about that.
It's funny, quite honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's both funny and oh my god, they have to do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's right. It really is what we do. I mean, it wasn't just made up.
And there's wit in this film elsewhere too. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, often it's a sort of the savage, ironical version of wit. What did Snowden think of it?
He was, you know, I was really. What I was worried about is that he would have some expectations. He knew I was making a film, and that he would sit down with lots of expectations about what he thought would be the right film or the film to make, and there was none of that. I mean, and I think that's just partly his nature. He's really, you know, he sees people for, you know, he didn't try to, you know, project into what he wanted or what, you know, the film he thought I should make. And his response was great, and there was no vanity notes. There were no, you know, he had lots of notes about basically what is called operational security, like what's in each frame. Knowing each frame is going to be stopped frame by frame, not by film students, but by other people.
Maybe by film students, so hopefully at some point.
But you know, it's by intelligence agencies are going to stop this. And so we talked about. He made a lot of notes.
I hadn't thought of that part of it, of course.
Yeah, so like things like we did.
So his mindset was coming at it the same way he did everything else.
Yeah. I mean, I think I haven't talked to him since we've done the release. I haven't had a lot of downtime, and I talked to him on a particular computer that's more secure, and I haven't been able to really spend time. And I also just wanted it to play out, you know. So I think he's going to be a little bit surprised that the world is as interested as it is in what happened, and I hope in not a bad way. Yeah.
This is Nick Dawson from Talkhouse Film, and you've been listening to James Marsh and Laura Poitras in conversation on the Talkhouse Film podcast. The episode was engineered and edited by Elia Einhorn. For more filmmakers talking film and TV, visit thetalkhouse.com/film. Subscribe to Talkhouse Film and Talkhouse Music podcasts on iTunes, where you can find all our previous episodes. And while you're there, please rate and review if you can.